Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and today we're talking about old raids. A lot of people have talked about the innovation and freshness of the latest Final Fantasy XIV Savage raid, the Arcadian Cruiserweight Division. It's a mix of old ideas with modern execution, and it got me thinking about some of the game's older raid encounters. What about these old encounters worked, what didn't work, and what could be done to make them work? So, welcome to my Raid Retrospective series. Keep in mind, I once upon a time did rank all the fights in each expansion from worst to best, the trial series, the raids, everything. This video will be a more comprehensive look at those older encounters, insight into how the fights worked in their prime, and if we might see a return of these ideas, as the dev team exclaims that they're not afraid to try things they've shied away from in recent years. Maybe they need to go all the way back for some of the best ideas they had, or maybe there's some things they should just keep staying away from. Let's find out. For this video, we are strictly going to be focusing on the first Binding Coils of Bahamut, turns 1 through 5, the raid series that started it all, and the first place where the dev team learned some pretty valuable lessons about their development of these raids. There was a lot working against them at the time. The game had barely been in development for 3 years when this stuff released, and there were a lot of bugs and problems, especially with the final encounter. Heck, the game actually had a 300 ms latency built into it, which was remedied in patch 2.1. Thank goodness, because if Titan Hard Mode was bad with 300 ms, Titan Extreme would have been a disaster. Starting with turn 1, our first ever impression of raids in Final Fantasy XIV was made to feel a little bit more like some experienced MMO vets might expect when they hear the term raid. You come to an initial boss after exploring the opening catacombs, and then you have to defeat the ADS, which is just a slightly stronger trash mob with a few basic mechanics. After that, you mow down a whole bunch of other trash mobs, you have a few treasure chests that are hidden around specific bends, but none of it really ends up amounting to much of anything. On initial clears, it was fine, but on re-clears, players complained about how it was just wasted time doing all of these random trash mobs that just didn't have any rewards. I think most people agree that it's not inherently bad to have trash, especially if you can make that trash interesting, as was shown in the Criterion dungeons in Endwalker. But if they ever return to this form for the actual endgame raids outside of the normal modes, then I would definitely want there to be some reason that you value these mobs or that they stand in your path in the first place. Perhaps a way of getting crafting materials for crafted sets, or even unique rewards outright. The game isn't really built for that kind of thing, but most players tend to agree that if we do get trash again, and we do get these more actual exploration style openings before we get to the raid boss themselves, that it would be nice to have something in return. I think even pink gear, which is gear with random stats if you don't remember, could help struggling raiders who are just looking for something extra on any given week. Something that they would definitely replace from the bosses themselves, but you might get a little bit excited about if you saw something that had a decent amount of substats for the job that you were looking to get it for. Now, the boss itself in turn 1 is Caduceus. At least I think that's what it is. I'm kind of just doing the pronunciation from memory. Honestly, it's kind of a really basic boss. It's a snake, it has an instant frontal cleave, a baitable tail cleave, which can take some much needed pressure off of the tank, and spits poison puddles at allies at random. The main mechanic is that it gradually increases its damage until it starts basically one-shotting the tanks and eventually everyone else. This can be mitigated by spawning slimes by standing on glowing platforms throughout the fight. Any amount of players that are standing on these glowing platforms will spawn slimes, so you have to make sure that you're coordinating who's actually responsible for doing that and where the slime itself is actually going to spawn. Feeding a slime to Caduceus will restore its health relative to the current HP of the slime, but also reduce its damage stacks by 1. The slime itself fixates on whoever spawned it, and running too far away will cause it to explode and wipe the raid. Caduceus will then split into 2 separate bosses at 66%, splitting its HP, getting a permanent damage dealt reduction to make up for the fact that there's now 2 of them, but also duplicating whatever remaining damage stacks it had at the time. And then each individual Caduceus will have all of the same mechanics, including gradually increasing its damage and being able to be fed slimes. Parties would split into 2 light parties and balance when they would actually do things like spawn slimes, feed slimes, how they would handle the healing. And you just also had to keep them separated. If they were left too close together, they would re-merge and begin spamming the damage buffs and frontal cleaves to attempt to quickly wipe the party. Also, if one Caduceus is killed, the remaining one will also begin enraging. Another unique aspect about this fight is that the arena is not a uniform height or even shape, with various hexagons, that's a hexagon, right? Sure, we're gonna go with hexagon, connecting to one another. There's also pieces of over-aspected crystals that form paths and become corrupted on pull. Any player stepping on them will get a bleed debuff that just deals some damage over time, but goes away as soon as you step off of the crystal. These pathways are the only way to reach the upper platforms, which is sometimes necessary in order to actually spawn slimes. A lot of the design here is actually very interesting. The fact that the boss will gradually get stronger and stronger, and it's completely within the party's power to maintain or manage that damage increase, is actually something that gives a lot of player agency to how the fight is handled. Not to mention, the importance of the slime gradually rehealing the boss means that you can start to make player decisions where maybe you want to skip feeding a slime because the damage increase is still manageable, but you don't want to give it more health in order to extend the fight. This becomes especially prevalent once the boss splits into two, and you can choose to maybe feed one slime to one and let the other continue to get stronger, and then switch, and then by the time they actually become too much, they're already basically dead. You can also deliberately decide to merge them at some point and use tank invulns in order to swap off and just try to finish it with all 8 players all stacking their buffs onto a single snake. The use of the arena is also incredibly unique, having those pathways, having that very large non-uniform experience, and the way that even the glowing platforms are actually done. I'd say that Caduceus, while being an incredibly simple boss that doesn't really demand a whole lot of the party and is severely susceptible to being overgeared and outright cheesed, is actually a pretty good design for a boss in an overall status, especially for something that appears in an earlier turn. I love the idea of a boss that gradually powers up and you have to work against the boss in whatever way is actually controllable by the party to stop it from becoming an unmanageable thing. While they would definitely have to modernize the way mechanics are done and probably give it a lot more flair if they were to do an idea like this nowadays, it's definitely an idea that I think deserves to be revisited if they are actually looking to create more unique experiences. I'm obviously not saying they should just bring Caduceus back and just do the exact same thing, but in a modern setting, though maybe they could. I would still want whatever boss that has this sort of feeling to it to really stand on its own 2 feet and not just be Caduceus 2.0. But it's an idea, and one that I think for their very first raid boss is incredibly impressive, even with the shortcomings of gear completely overriding it, and the fact that a lot of these mechanics were not well communicated to the player. In the modern day, you would get something like a tether that maybe would show you when you were getting too far from the slime, and even give you a second to realize you were getting too far in the first place. They would also probably make it a little bit more manageable in some other regards, especially with the over-aspected platforms and how you actually chose to interact. They would probably have to have you swapping between players because you would get a debuff when you leave the crystal. That means you can't do it over and over again. The randomness of the platforms would probably be a little less random nowadays, so I think it actually worked in this case because you could sometimes have pulls where someone like a black mage could sit up top and they could just be having a grand old time, and sometimes they'd have to put in a little more work. And we do get that kind of pull-to-pull variance a lot of the times with other fights, especially as we look forward into other raid tiers. But this actually gets a thumbs up for me on Caduceus. Really solid idea, and if the dev team's looking for some inspiration for some new concepts or things they want to return to, I would love to see them do this one. Then we get to turn 2, which is also an incredibly unique encounter when compared to all of Final Fantasy XIV that would come after that. Instead of there just being one main boss and maybe having adds or its own specific mechanics, the entirety of turn 2 is actually the boss arena itself. There's a bunch of different hallways and pathways that lead between several mini-boss nodes that will then empower the final boss based on the paths that you actually take. Each node has a unique mechanic and a specific resistance to damage types that it will apply to all subsequent nodes after it's defeated. By defeating one, the final boss will gain that type of damage resistance relative to the one that you chose, but can no longer access that node's special attack, giving again a lot of player agency on how they progress through. If your team has a lot of magic damage, for example, you wouldn't want to increase the boss's magic resistance. You don't just want to deal 25% less damage. Now, I will say this right now before I get into it, I don't think we would ever see a boss that specifically negates any specific type of damage. We have moved very, very far away from that design in Final Fantasy XIV because it has led to an insane amount of toxicity in the past. Entire jobs being written off for a whole expansion because they just couldn't make them make sense when compared to the damage resistance debuffs that other jobs were bringing. Trust me, I've tried to play one of those jobs in that setting, and it's hard to convince people that you're worth bringing when you're the monk with blunt resistance down and nobody really cares because the int reduction you have also is covered by somebody else. That being said, the idea of being able to choose bosses leading up to a final boss in order to lock away its abilities or even provide it with new ones is something that's just kind of cool, even if we all know eventually everyone will land on the same strategy. As for the individual nodes, it's important to know what each of them did, as you could weigh the options of which one you would leave alive and which ones you would want to kill. The monitoring node was always first, so you didn't have a choice, and upon defeating it would increase the damage of all subsequent nodes. It also has the vacuum wave ability, which just does some raid-wide damage every few seconds. This ability is also present in the final fight, even though you defeat the monitoring node, just because there's a separate one that's untargetable that's keeping you in combat as you progress through the gauntlet. Then there's the sanitary node, which upon being defeated would increase the piercing resistance for all subsequent nodes. Its special attack was Ballast, which was a 270-degree conal AoE, so just one little corner of it was safe, and that was one that people often got rid of. Then there was the attack node, which would increase blunt resistance to all subsequent nodes once defeated, and its special attack would just put a little gravity well AoE under a random player. Not very important, but you had to kill it if you were on the way to the boss, and you would probably go that way after defeating the sanitary node anyway, which was far more important to kill. The defense node was on the other side of the arena, and this would increase slashing resistance if killed for all subsequent nodes. Its special attack was Chain Lightning, which would just hop from person to person. The Chain Lightning didn't get stronger every time it hopped, so it was perfectly manageable. It basically became an extra 1-by-1 hit on every player and becomes just a raid-wide AoE if everyone actually gets hit by it. This was not overly threatening, so this was often left alive for most groups. There's also the Disposal node, which increases magic resistance once defeated for all subsequent nodes. Its special attack was Fire Stream, which would fire a line AoE at the tank and then 4 separate ones all in like a star pattern outward from the boss. Since it was just dodging line AoEs, this was also often left alive. And finally, before the boss, you also have the Quarantine node, hovering on the south side of the arena, very out of the way and for very good reason. This gave the boss its most dangerous ability and the thing that it was most known for, Allagan Rot. This had to be passed, and if it ever fully expired or the player with it died, it would explode and wipe the raid. Most people would think to get rid of the Quarantine node, but upon defeating it, it would give a 50% haste buff to the final boss, meaning that almost all of its abilities would come out way too fast, way too frequently, especially given that you had to silence the high voltage skill on all of these targets. So if you just didn't have that availability, you didn't have that reaction time, it would quickly become a disaster. So almost everyone would leave the Quarantine node alive. And finally, that brings us to ADS, a rematch against that door boss from the first encounter. It eats any unkilled node every 25% of its health, starting with the Quarantine node and working its way northward depending on what you actually left alive. It gains that node's special attack, and it will have a special ability, and it will have a special resistance, based on everything killed before it. So if you kill the monitoring node, the sanitary node, and the attack node, it would have increased damage dealt, increased piercing resistance, and increased blunt resistance. And then, of course, trade out any other nodes if you killed an extra one or, just went down a different path, and you can apply that to everything. While it was essentially just a small rematch with the Allagan Rot mechanic, it became very notorious for becoming a very difficult time. The 300 MS made dodging a lot of its faster attacks much more difficult. AoEs were much harder to see back then, especially if you're me, and it was a time. However, I mentioned at the beginning that the Enrage itself actually began when when engaging with the monitoring node. And Well, the Enrage is kind of what this fight is known for, because the Enrage is not actually an Enrage. The boss just begins spamming a very powerful room-wide AoE that is not lethal. So what became the standard amongst Duty Finder groups was that they would actually just let it Enrage and then just mitigate through all of the damage that the boss was dealing in order to just not have to do Allagan Rot or literally any other mechanic. So it made it really, really simple for people with enough gear to just kind of brute force their way through it. While this entire idea is fantastic, it has tons of flaws, especially when it came to the resistance types. Nobody wanted slashing resistance down because enmity was seriously a problem at this time. So you didn't want your tank just generating 25% less enmity. On top of that, black mages and bards were really common, so while you could choose between piercing resistance or magic resistance, most people would just not opt for the magic resistance, especially given that Fire Stream and Chain Lightning, the path you would have to take in order to actually get the magic resistance down, were much easier attacks to deal with than the Ballast or the Gravity Well, which would force your team to move off, which could also just slowly start to take up more and more space in the room. So the biggest flaw with these types of fights is that there's almost always going to be a point where player agency is no longer a thing. And that was the biggest problem they had with a lot of the older Realm Reborn raids. Really good ideas that took player agency so far that it eventually gets taken away. It's nice when players have to learn lots of permutations for an encounter, 2 or 3 for most Savage encounters, and be able to react to something that is kind of known, but you're never really sure if it's going to go exactly the same way every time. And they have dabbled with this in kind of the in-between raids, between what we had way back in Coil and what we have now, where it's often role-based or can't target certain roles and stuff like that. So there is kind of an in-between, and I do think they get close enough with the ideas of these skills being semi-random or really fast, or it being able to choose what skills the boss has, but they just kind of take that away and keep the same kind of random agency, and it starts to work a lot better. I do think that they could go back to this, but one of the biggest problems with being able to choose when a boss gets a skill is they often didn't really consider the boss's rotations. The boss kind of just has a bunch of skills that happen every so often, and because they were just happening every so often, they weren't very interesting. Like ADS was a line AoE, a point blank AoE, an instant cast tank buster, and something that you needed to interrupt, plus whatever you actually gave it as an additional skill. So if you have Allagan Rod, eventually you're just all stacked up, and suddenly all these other mechanics don't really matter. Chain Lightning is just going to add some extra damage on everyone, and Fire Stream is just going to be another sidestep like with the laser. So because of all of that, it's just a boss with a bunch of AoEs that happen at not really random times, but also not really entirely set times. Also, based on when you actually push the boss to actually eat one of the adds, it can just kind of interrupt and change the rotation on a pull-to-pull basis without really making the encounter any more interesting. So, very similar to Caduceus, if they were to modernize a fight like this, they probably have to make the skills you're choosing far more impactful and make the decision to remove one from the encounter far more impactful. And on top of that, they also need to be somewhat closer to each other in terms of effectiveness. I think it's more likely that they would give you a boss, for example, and then within the actual boss encounter, there's objects around the room that can temporarily disable a skill or can temporarily make you immune to a certain skill. And we do see this approach, and actually as we go into the later parts, as we go into Midas, where they give the players control over how to counter the skills with an intention without outright making them do it a specific way. I think that's the evolution that they do land on, but this whole gauntlet of choosing bosses thing is another really cool idea that you gotta give the original dev team credit for. It definitely has some problems, and there's some things that, you know, they definitely weren't thinking about when they made it, not too uncommon for back then, but it's still great to see that they had this creativity and drive to even just give this kind of thing a shot back then, especially when everything was on the line with the Realm Reborn's release. Maybe that put the onus on them to try to be creative with encounters like Turn 2, and again, would like to see them return to this. Gets another thumbs up from me. And then we get to Turn 3, and this is the one time where all I can say to you is no. Turn 3 is literally just a giant bunch of trash that you have to run past and get to the end of. There's no boss here. There's no loot here. There's nothing interesting here. This kind of just follows the same precedent that I set with the trash at the beginning of turn 1, and that the only way this is valuable is if you do something like add pink gear that's still not as good as the raid gear, but a player could still look forward to a potential upgrade when they're doing this on the weekly. But even then, just the idea of an entire turn that's only trash that you're then locked out of for the week, maybe it could work, but I'm definitely not going to give this one the thumbs up. I just think it's silly. If you're going to do trash, just include it as part of a turn that ends in a boss. And then we get to turn 4, which is actually an incredibly relevant discussion to be having right now. Ad fights have really not been a thing in Final Fantasy XIV for some time, and turn 4, and to some extension what will eventually be A2, are really the big reasons why. They are really cool ideas that very quickly showcase the problem when you do a fight that's entirely focused on only killing ads. Obviously, this is the discussion because currently in M6, or just Cruiserweight M2 Savage if you prefer, the ads have become kind of the giant community meme. They're a wall that's hurting people in the PF and will gradually get easier with gear, but doesn't feel great to do right now if you're struggling to get past them, but exhibit a great deal of confidence and innovation to the way that ad phases have historically been. There really isn't an ad phase that's anything like Cruiserweight M2, and even the comparisons that some people have levied, things like Turn 4, things like even Halicarnassus and Omega, just don't have the same cadence as that fight. And so I think it's fair to say it is the proper evolution of what they started with here in Turn 4. Now, what is turn 4 actually as an encounter? Well, it is 6 waves of trash mobs that just spawn on a timer. And much like with the much shorter ad phase in M6, you just need to make sure that you're managing to kill enough things before the next wave comes out. If you manage to kill everything in a wave, the next wave will then spawn, but if you don't kill them fast enough, the next wave will come anyway. And each different mob has its own set purpose, though back then the purposes were much simpler. Wave 1 just has 6 clockwork bugs, which will just leech HP from whichever tank they're hitting, and don't really have a whole lot of health. However, when 6 of them are beating on one person, it can very quickly become a problem when there's other things alive. Fortunately, the clockwork bugs kind of just serve a purpose that becomes evident on Wave 3. Then on Wave 2, we have the Clockwork Knights and the Clockwork Soldiers, each of them meant to be taken down by a physical DPS player or a magical DPS player. The Knight has an anti-magic stone skin and will also reflect magic damage back to the user. The Soldier simply has an anti-physical stone skin but does not reflect any damage. Breaking either of these stone skins would cause them to stop attacking, which could provide some much needed relief for any tank that happened to be taking multiple at the same time, especially if they happen to run out of cooldowns. You would then have to weigh which ones you would actually focus down killing as somebody who could actually damage against the stone skin. For example, me as a bard, I would be hitting the Knight because the Knight would reflect magic damage but won't reflect what I'm doing to it. Whereas a black mage would target a soldier because it has an anti-physical stone skin. However, it was totally feasible for a tank to say hit the soldier enough times to break the stone skin and then not take any damage from that target. And then everyone can hit it as well because the stone skin is gone for like 10 seconds. Having that decision making being a part of the process is incredibly valuable, again, for player agency, but also comes with the downside of kind of forcing certain compositions if you want things to work. And while they still occasionally mess around with stuff where, you know, physical damage users can do this and magic can do that, it's something we don't see in the mainline Savage content because they don't want to force specific comps to be better more often than not. Of course, we all know don't bring 2 Fizz range unless it's your only option and you're just raiding with friends, in which case go nuts. But, you know, other than that, you know, it was much different times back then. We had like 1 bard and like 3 black mages for turn 2, so we could just do whatever we want back then. Much different story now. Then you get to Wave 3 and you get 4 more Clockwork Bugs, but you also get the Clockwork Dreadnought. The Dreadnought was just a really tough mob, not unlike a big mechanical Yan in that sense. It would auto-attack and every 3 autos do a strong instant cleave, but it would also eat the bugs if they got close enough, restoring 25% of its health for each bug and granting it a 25% damage dealt buff. It was often just considered that, hey, we're going to feed all 4 of these bugs and then we're going to zerg it down with cooldowns to make sure that we don't have to kill 4 bugs and kill a Dreadnought and keep them separate the entire time. We just don't have the time to do all of that. Now, that's obviously a lot different than the Yan, which just needs to be kept away from the moves pretty much the entire time and dealt with in isolation, but the idea is the same, to present one great threat that the tanks need to deal with that puts the onus on the party to deal with everything more quickly to stop the tank from taking too much damage. Now, one really specific thing that's interesting is the Spinner Rook, the last new enemy that was available in turn 4. While there are 4 clockwork bugs in wave 4, there are also 2 Spinner Rooks. They had the Gravity Thrust Tank Buster, which would heal the Rook slightly, but their main mechanic was Pox, which they would cast on a target, but you could line of sight Pox by walking behind opponents. A Realm Reborn actually did this a lot, where some attacks it was intended that you would walk behind a target in order to interrupt its cast. And I don't mean hide behind a pillar or something, literally walk directly in a straight line through the enemy and just kind of fool it into thinking you're behind it. I mean, you've had that happen against the boss in this game, right? You go to use an ability and then it walks behind you and your ability cancels. That was a main mechanic in this actual fight. And they've moved away from it because it's really hard to communicate to the player that that's what you intend for them to do. I think line of sight mechanics, A, we still see them nowadays, and B, they're done with much more obvious nuance, but I think I see why they wouldn't do this idea, and I kind of agree that they will probably never do it again. After wave 4, waves 5 and 6 really just become trying to overwhelm the player with things they've already seen. Dreadnought, Knight, and Soldier in the wave 5, and wave 6 is 2 bugs, another Dreadnought, a Rook, a Knight, and a Soldier. I mean, we had to do whatever we could with the bare minimum gear to make things like that work. I remember having a Black Mage kite a mob around. In fact, there should be footage of that in my clear. We would have the DPS all pile on a target to try to break its stone skin to prevent it from dealing damage. We would feed the bugs, but we would have to make sure that one Dreadnought was done from wave 5 before the Dreadnought in wave 6, otherwise it would be too much. We had to make sure the tanks stayed top. The tanks might have to kite in order to try to reduce the damage they were taking. It was making use of the space without kind of sabotaging the other things that were happening, and that's kind of the chief thing that ends up happening with ad fights and makes the chaos a lot of fun. Something that, again, is captured very well in M6. As much as I'm kind of okay with the idea of doing another full ad fight, something like turn 4, or eventually what we'll talk about A2, I think M6 is the more masterfully done version. The boss is present. The boss still does things that affect the actual ads. The boss is the one spawning the ads the whole time. It causes you to kind of consider how your cleave damage is. It forces a new skill upon the player that they can then learn and hopefully use in future encounters that use similar ideas without using the exact same ideas. So I don't even need to give this one a thumbs up. It was a cool fight for the time, completely trivialized with gear, more than almost any other fight in existence in Final Fantasy XIV, but its idea, I think, has already been executed upon better with that of M6. And then finally, we come to turn 5. Quite frankly, one of the biggest problem childs in all of Final Fantasy XIV. Turn 5 was a fight both ahead and behind of its time, as it was constantly not working as intended, had to be hot fixed and taken offline tons of times, and strictly due to the 300 ms delay, took almost 2 months before it was defeated for the first time. After, it was subsequently nerfed and they basically just made the timing on the twister mechanic more forgiving, and then the clears started pouring in. But you don't know pain till you've spent 5, 6, 7 weeks on a fight where the game itself, the core aspect of the game, the built-in latency, can honestly just make it so you gotta position in such a way that if latency gets you, maybe only you die. And you just gotta sit there and take it, pull after pull, and just pray it works. And then someone finds a bug that elevation-wise means that the boss becomes completely inactive, and you have to find little glitches in the fight to make certain things work out better. It's pretty much an example of something they should never do again. But that doesn't mean there weren't some interesting ideas that were in the Twintania encounter itself. I mean, obviously, Twintania eventually would go on to play a role in the unending coil of Bahamut. Heck, Twintania's model and mechanics were used in the final coils of Bahamut as well as an add in turn 13. And a certain version of it would even feature in DSR, which would continue the trend of making go, not twisters again. I mean, the start of the fight is just kind of so basic. There's 3 Scourges that spit puddles at players that you just have to kill before you can really start damaging the boss. And then the boss has 2 different tank busters. One's a cleave, one just hits the tank itself. But really, just dealing with the 3 Scourges is the entire first 15% of the fight. Phase 2, on the other hand, will drop the Neuralink onto the ground, which is eventually used for a couple of mechanics, but does make the fight a good bit more interesting. Death Sentence, the Tank Buster, now has an additional effect, and that is something that I like to see them do. When a Tank Buster starts a fight working one way and then gradually evolves to work in different ways as the fight continues on. Now, that's a very different way of doing something like a Tank Buster that just gives a Vuln up, or, you know, maybe the Tank Buster itself, like something like Color Riot, where the tanks have to be paying attention to in or out, or M7, where they have to see here or there. There are other ways that Tank Busters can be made interesting and have been, but the idea that the Tank Buster itself will begin to apply additional effects as the fight advances is definitely something I think they should be looking to do as a really minor way of sort of giving the tanks a little bit more to think about. The most interesting thing, I think, in the entire fight is actually the red marker and the blue marker, the fireball and the conflagration. A red marker on a player shoots a fireball at them. It deals split damage to that target and anyone else hit. But for each player hit, Twintania gains a stacking buff called Wax and Flesh. Wax and Flesh then interacts with the blue marker, so how you handle Fireball becomes very important to how you handle Conflagration. The blue marker applies Conflagration on a target and anyone near them when it finishes. It traps them in a fire puddle that stuns them. It doesn't allow them to move or do anything at all. Deals a bit of damage over time and will explode if not killed fast enough, only killing the players inside of it or even the player standing maybe just a mite bit too close. However, while you're killing the conflagration to free them, the time you have before the conflagration actually explodes is determined by how many stacks of Wax and Flesh that Twintania has. The more stacks they have, the shorter the conflagration timer. So players had to come up with a system where they can make sure that they always had 3, at most 4 players that were eating a conflagration, or I'm sorry, eating a fireball, so that they could actually kill the conflagration in a fast enough period of time. That also ended up playing into the way everyone actually handled the conflagrations, because you could actually abuse the fact that it stunned you and trapped you to completely negate certain mechanics. For example, a player with a fireball could step into a conflagration to cancel it out. That would also mean that the next conflagration would have no stacks of Wax and Flesh, so it would make the next one a little bit easier to deal with from time to time. Even tanks could step into a conflagration in order to avoid a death sentence tank buster, so there was lots of ways to play around the fact that this skill would stun players and basically make them non-targets for the boss. That being said, that interaction is, I think, the most interesting bit, because the timer for Fireball and the timer for Conflagration didn't always make that same play pattern possible. You kind of just had to know the timeline of the fight to know when it was possible to feed a Fireball to a Conflagration safely without putting either the Fireball player or the Conflagration player at risk. And Tankbusters also had to learn, listen, if I see Death Sentence and I see the conflagration is almost dead, I'm not going to pop no cooldowns and try to step into the soon-to-be dead conflagration, because that might just get me killed. So same deal. It became a lot about knowing timings, and that was, again, kind of a boon and a curse for earlier tier Final Fantasy XIV bosses. Everything was on timers as opposed to being kind of a set rotation. Again, for players who had done the fights a lot, that's fine. You know, they learn the timers, they memorize the order of the boss's skills when they go off, and nowadays, of course, there would be all sorts of, you know, add-ons and stuff. I mean, have you seen WoW? WoW basically is a game that runs almost entirely on timers and eventually having skills overlap in really inconvenient ways. That's kind of what it would end up looking like nowadays, and I don't think they want that necessarily in order for players to track the order of skills. They'd rather you just know the order of the skills and be able to react to whatever the boss actually does. I don't think either approach is right or wrong. I think there are places where just being on a bunch of timers works, especially when the attacks are far more threatening than the stuff we had in turn 2. Stuff like Fireball and Conflagration mixed in with the enhanced Death Sentence. But it obviously comes with its problems as well, because it's just not very new player friendly. It's not communicated to the player in a super effective way, and it increases the reliance on add-ons, which I don't think is ever a healthy thing for the game in any capacity. Then you get to a kind of a traditional-ish ad phase. You know, the boss goes into the air and you got to bait a few dive bombs. Nowadays, we know of the secret spot in Twin Tanya where you can just bait all of the dive bombs and you just step into a little nook and then step out and step in, step out. And it's super easy to do, and it's what everyone learned and would kind of reference back to. But some of us just dodged dive bombs the old-fashioned way. We're just like group up and move together, group up and move together. We memorized all the potential spots that could spawn and came up with a pattern that would make it easier for everyone to dodge. And then in between a bunch of dive bombs, you had a bunch of ads to deal with. The Hygeias would explode and put a vulnerability up debuff on any nearby anything, including the other Hygeias and the main ad, the Asclepius. So people would just make sure that the Hygeias hit the Asclepius mobs without hitting the tanks as best as they possibly could, and then zerg the Asclepius down before the ad phase itself was actually done. Then phase 4 would begin, Twin Tanya would return, use a raid wide, and this raid wide could only be survived if you were standing in a Neuralink. Every time Twin Tanya did the phase change up to this point, there was a Neuralink drop, so there should have been 2 of them on the ground, and that positioning was something we retroactively had to go back and look at, although it didn't end up being that important in the grand scheme of things. At least having 2 separate ones was a bare minimum to make sure that Twin Tanya didn't immediately plummet the party when the phase actually was starting. This is where the infamous Twister skill would come out. It just dropped a landmine under a player when it cast. It locked onto the player's position about 75% through the Twister cast, but with 300 MS, sometimes it would just spawn under you and there was nothing you could do about it back then. Obviously, not the problem nowadays. Twin Tanya's Twisters were fixed then and they've been used a ton of times since, so everyone kind of knows how they actually work. The more important thing was the Dread Knight it would summon in the center of the room, and this is definitely the vibes I get when I look at the Jabberwock in M6. The Dread Knight would actually just spawn in the middle, and then Twin Tanya would target a player and stun them in place. And then the Dread Knight would walk towards them, and if it reaches them, it kills them, and then Twin Tanya picks another target. You could stun it, you could heavy it, you could do all sorts of things to try to hold it in place. Heck, warriors would home gang it in order to bind it in place. I suspect that might be why the Jabberwock in M6 cannot be bound, because warrior home gang would have at least been used on one of those Jabberwocks almost certainly in order to hold it in place, because that's what we did way back when. Sounds like a lesson learned for them, although I do actually really like when that kind of interaction exists, so I was more disappointed than I was understanding of the Jabberwock not being able to be bound. But it was simple, you know, stun, heavy, kill. It just had to CC the heck out of the thing. And then the final phase, shooting liquid hells at players and summoning hatches. The hatches would kill a player if they weren't standing in a Neuralink when it actually hit them, and in the small explosion around it, so if you were too close to another player with a hatch, there was a good chance it could just kill you too. Most players just stack tanks inside of the Neuralink itself to try to eat them before they ever actually got to their intended target, but you could also just have players step into hover around wherever a Neuralink was and step in with their own hatch, and it was just as fine. And that's it for Twin Tanya. There's not a whole lot I would look back on Twin Tanya and say we need to do more of, mostly because Twin Tanya and their mechanics have been reused several times in several expansions since this, and the more interesting things I think require a lot of finessing to do. Again, the Fireball and Conflagration interaction is so interesting and unique that that's kind of the one thing I would like to see come back, the management of some skills that could appear on a timer and interact with other skills. But given how bad the timer situation would get with subsequent encounters and how bad poorly timed phase transitions would occur as well, lead me to believe that they probably won't be returning to that kind of form, which is definitely going to depress especially the old school MMO vets. Not the old school Final Fantasy XIV players, but I mean the old school MMO vets, where kind of random stuff or timer related stuff is really what we grew up on and was our bread and butter. But I'd say that's a bread and butter I've moved on with. I've moved up to better bread and better butter. Okay, this joke isn't working. And that's going to be a wrap for my retrospect on the Binding Coils. It's shocking to see how many actually good ideas they had back then that would probably age poorly nowadays, but let's be honest, the dev team's goal should be to look at things that are creatively interesting and find a way to make them work. It shouldn't be it can't work. It should be how do we make it work? And then, you know, maybe they go through a process, they don't figure it out, they move on and try something else. And I really hope they decide to at least give those types of processes a shot. There's a lot of really basic raid style ideas that I've witnessed in other MMOs that we haven't seen yet, and I'll definitely be bringing those up as we continue to advance through the various raids in Final Fantasy XIV. But that's going to be a wrap for my first raid raid retrospective video. Be sure to like and subscribe, and let me know what your thoughts are on the Binding Coils old mechanics. Let me know what you're looking forward to in the future videos, as well as I'm sure we're going to have quite a few of these for weeks to come. Anyway, I will see all of you in the next one, and until then, take care.